both Terence and Michael for coming and giving, I think, very educational presentations. In particular, thanks to Terence for dragging the Socialist Party into the 21st century with PowerPoint presentations. I think that's an historic first for the Socialist Party. 20th century. I'm going to start with a quote from Karl Marx, writing at the end of the 19th century in Capital Volume 3, which I haven't read, but I did read the quote, where
nobody has.
He's describing a capitalist crisis, and he talks about unemployed capital at one pole and unemployed worker population at the other pole. And it's a perfect description of the situation that faces advanced capitalist countries. It's a perfect description of what faces us in the EU, where you have 3 trillion euros being hoarded by rich corporations, effectively in cash and ultra-liquid assets, and then on the other hand 25 million workers unemployed. It's a perfect description of the crisis we have in Ireland, where you still have 74 billion euros in corporate deposits in Irish banks, at the same time as you have 440,000 people on the dole. And the point that is important that he's making is that this isn't a crisis because of an absence of resources. There isn't a crisis because we've run out of capital. There isn't a crisis because we've run out of workers who are talented and skilled and able to do stuff with that capital. And it isn't a crisis because we've run out of important things to be done. If anything, there's more important, socially useful, economically useful things to be done. So it's not a crisis of an absence of resources. It's not a crisis of an overall society. It's a problem with the way that the economy and the way that society is organised. Fundamentally, it's a crisis of the capitalist mode of production, as in the organisation of the economy for profit, as opposed to the organisation of the economy for people's needs. It is a crisis very much rooted in that capitalist system. And in particular, as Ruth was talking about, it's a crisis rooted in the decline of investment, which is, an historic decline. There's a quote from The Economist 2 years ago, where they said that business investment is at the lowest level that it has ever been as a percentage of GDP. So in the history of capitalism, it was never lower. And actually, if anything, it's probably declined further since that point. The fact that if you look at the total decline of GDP in the OECD economies, so the advanced economies, 80% of it can be accounted for by decline of investment. If you look at the decline of investment against the shrinking of GDP, 80% is made up. And in Ireland, it's more than 100%. In Ireland, GDP has shrunk by about 30 billion euros, and investment has fallen by 32.5 billion euros. So a massive crisis of collapse of investment. And that being linked to the crisis, yes, but coming before the crisis as well and being rooted in a decline of profitability for capitalism. So a deep, deep crisis of capitalism, for which I don't think will be resolved progressively on the basis of the continuation of the capitalist system. I think we can go through Plan B and Plan C, and I think eventually we'll get to Plan S, which will be socialist change. Because I think that it's not to say, I don't think we're just going to have continuous recession, right? Because I don't think we're going to have socialist change in Ireland in the next 2 or 3 years. I don't think that's the most likely perspective. And I think you can have an exit from recession, you can have a level of growth. I think it's likely that we're in a period of capitalist crisis. We're not going to go back into a long boom or anything like that. And in Ireland, we're not going to go back to a Celtic tiger. But certainly, they're attempting, if their problem is profitability, they're attempting to restore profitability through austerity. And so there are reactionary semi-solutions to the crisis. But I think, a progressive aspect, a progressive resolution of the crisis requires going beyond capitalism. And I think, an aspect, I was going to go on about there is no alternative as well. And it is the message that the media is using, that the government is using, that the establishment across all of the capitalist world really are using. There's no alternative to austerity, there's no alternative to neoliberalism. But there's something deeper as well. And it's very, very widespread, and it's somewhat well established with people. And it's the idea that there's no alternative to organising society on a capitalist basis. And that there might be this policy or that policy, but fundamentally, that's the way the economy is. That's the way society is organised. And so I think one of the things we have to do as socialists is to reject that common sense position that things are as they are, there's no other way of organising society, that we can put forward an alternative to capitalist anarchy, to an alternative to the running of society and the economy for profit. And that alternative is a socialist alternative based on the planning of production, the planning of the economy, democratically, for people's needs. And that's effectively what I want to put forward and speak about in headline fashion. What does that mean? What would such a program mean? It's important, I'm going to put forward a number of propositions as to what a socialist government, a workers' government would do in Ireland if it was to come to power tomorrow. It is, of course, important to stress that this isn't going to happen in, a peaceful fashion, not in the sense of necessarily violence, but in the sense of without a massive struggle. It isn't a question of us convincing the capitalists of, well, there's a more rational way of organising society. If you could only do this, this and this, things would be better. The capitalists give it up, they hand over the keys of power to the working class, we set up workers' councils, and that's it. You're talking about a period of intense, deep capitalist crisis, and in particular intense, deep, massive class struggle. And that's the reality. I mean, there is a massive class war being waged all across the world, in particular in Europe, in particular in the peripheral economies of Europe. And the weapon of the capitalists in that class war is austerity. And unfortunately in Ireland it is to a large extent a one-sided class war. In other countries it is less so a one-sided class war. In Greece, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, you can more talk about a battle that has been engaged in by the working class. See the two-day general strike that concluded yesterday in Greece, that made it extremely, extremely difficult for the Greek government to get their austerity package through. But it's in those conditions of massive crisis, turmoil and significant class struggle that we think will come to Ireland, that the prospect of working people coming to power, of kicking out the Troika, kicking out the establishment parties and establishing a government on a different basis, and also potentially organising on a different basis, in the sense that through the struggles of people, establishing institutions of power that are different than the institutions of power that currently operate, like the popular assemblies that were established in Greece that can become re-established again. That's the vision of how this sort of change can come about. And I think if you look at Greece, I mean, it's the closest example, it's the way people can see in the most realistic way how socialist change can come about. Because in Greece, I think it's likely that within a year, and I think probably within 6 months, a left government, a Syriza-led left government will be elected in Greece. I don't know what will happen after that. I don't know if Syriza will follow through on the expectations that people have. But it's a real prospect, people can see it. And I think you have to imagine a similar situation happening in Ireland. And then what do you do when you come to power? When working people come to power in such a circumstance, what are the key things that you need to do to try and point a way out of the crisis? The most immediate and pressing issue such a government would have, such a government in Greece, such a government in Ireland, in any of the peripheral European states, is the question of the debt. The debt, the national debt and the banking debt, is crippling all of those economies. I mean, the Irish, the debt before the crisis, government debt as a percentage of GDP was 25% in 2007. Yesterday or 2 days ago, the Commission said that it's going to go to over 120% next year. It's an absolutely unsustainable level of debt, the payment of which is destroying the economy and is being used as a weapon, like it was used in Latin America, to justify savage austerity, shifting the balance of power further away from labour towards capital. That it's the crisis that is responsible for the ballooning of that debt. It's the actual payment of the bank bailout. It's the most expensive bank bailout in the world. It's the collapse of tax revenue on the basis of the unsustainable model of tax revenue that we had based on construction. It's the collapse of GDP itself, therefore making the debt a much more onerous prospect of paying. And it's the deficit that was, as a result of that crisis, the deficit of the number of years since that crisis. I think the essential thing, and the first thing, number one item on the agenda of a workers' government in Ireland would be to repudiate that debt. Say that this is not our debt, we can't afford to pay this debt, and we refuse to pay it. We refuse to see our society, our economy destroyed in order to pay these bondholders. The government, there's going to be a lot of discussion about the budget for 2013 in the next month. And the government will say that there's a gap between what the government takes in and what the government spends, which will be in 2015 will be 2013 will be 15 billion euros. And so they say, well, if you kick out the Troika, you have to close that gap. If you close it in 1 year, you're not going to be able to access the international markets, etc., etc. But what they don't say, to give a picture of what this debt means, of that 15 billion euro gap, 9 billion is made up of interest payments to bondholders and the Anglo-Irish promissory note payments. So if you strip that out, you're left with a gap between government revenue and government expenditure of 6 billion, a much more figure that is capable to be tackled. Who are these bondholders that we don't want to pay? It isn't possible to say precisely who they are, because precisely the whole thing is shrouded in secrecy. But it is possible to estimate, and a bunch of people from the Debt and Development Coalition did a debt audit on the basis of the information that's available. And they worked out that 82% of the debt is foreign debt, 18% is based in Ireland. And you can work out that the vast majority of that debt is odious debt. It's not debt that should be paid back. It's not debt to people who own prize bonds. It's not debt to pension funds, as they like to suggest. There's a percentage of it. But you could definitely write it down by 75%, be left at 25% or less. The other debt they don't talk about, that again you would repudiate, is the private banking debt. They just give the impression that something separate is happening here. But in 2012, almost 20 billion euros were paid by so-called private banks that are owned by the Irish taxpayers to bondholders. That's on top. That doesn't come into the government deficit equation. That's separate money. In 2013, that figure will be 17 billion euro. In 2014, I think it's 13 billion euro. Then it goes down even further before going back up again. But you would repudiate that debt on the same basis, only paying on the basis of proven need, etc., after establishing a debt audit commission, and that money could be rediverted to social need, public investment. Of course, let's be realistic here. A workers' government coming to power, implementing anti-capitalist policies, in particular refusing to pay debt, that won't go down so well. It won't go down so well with the European Commission, it won't go down so well with the European Central Bank, it won't go down so well with the IMF. What will be unleashed, and this will happen in Greece in the next year potentially, if Syriza follows through on his programme, is a massive war will be unleashed against them by international capitalism. The markets will go haywire, the Troika will cut off any funding to the state, the ECB will cut off any funding to their banks, they'll attempt to collapse the banking system, they'll attempt to collapse the economy, to force the government out, and then attempt to force them out of the euro. And I think that's a realistic prospect. A government taking these actions would expect to be kicked out of the euro, to be forced out of the euro, to be forced to retake control of monetary policy, to be able to print its own money because of the actions that the Troika and the ECB would take against it. But on the other hand, you have to envisage the response that you get from ordinary people across Europe. That there would be, each of these countries, Ireland, Greece, Portugal, Spain, they aren't operating in isolation. You have the same conditions facing people, the same struggle being involved, and increasingly those struggles coming together, like the fact that the general strike on the 14th of November, now in 6 different countries across Europe. It's a very significant development in the struggle. And so such a move in any one country of a workers' government coming to power would have a tremendous impact across the other countries and would pose the real opportunity of that idea of fundamental change spreading to other countries. The next essential thing I think you'd have to do is, and I think Michael and, both Terence and Michael spoke about it, is one of the key problems at the moment is society is being run in the interests of the financial sector all across the world. This massive financial sector that is supposedly the oil of the capitalist system but has become so important and so dominant in the capitalist system. The reality is you have to turn that on its head and say, well, no, it's not good enough for society to be run for finance capital. Actually, the financial system should be turned into a democratically run public utility, and it should be used in the interests of society as a whole. You have to take control of the banks in exactly a real nationalisation, democratic public control, but also take control of the financial institutions. I mean, an interesting task faced by a workers' government in Ireland is not very far from here. About 2 trillion euros of funds are hosted in the IFSC, you'd have to do your best to try and grab hold of those. I think you'd have difficulty doing that. You'd have to nationalise, and on a worldwide basis, you're talking about, you know, Goldman Sachs, they're massive resources that are currently used to inflict pain on people all across the world, being taken into public ownership, and use that control of the financial system to make credit available to people, for small businesses, for farmers, to write down people's mortgages, to make credit available for ordinary people. And linked to that, and again, it has to be an essential, if you look at Greece, because it is the best example, some people say there's up to $1 billion a day have left Greece over the past year out of the banking system, with the rich and the corporations taking their money out of Greece because of fear of what's going to happen. An essential part of this would be to impose capital controls. You have to stop the rich taking the money out of the country. That's essential to say, well, the rights of this society is more important than the rights of the capitalists to move their money freely around the globe. You'd also, incidentally, have to impose limits on the amount of money that someone can take out of their bank account. You couldn't allow the rich just to walk into the bank account, take out 10 million, walk out of the bank and leave the country. That wouldn't be acceptable from the point of view of society as a whole. Just very briefly then, I think I agree with the proposal's massive programme of public investment. I think, you know, you'd be dealing with the fact that Irish capitalism is so crap and has so undeveloped the economy for such a long, long period of time. You know, the roads, which yes, they're better now than they used to be, the insulation, the water pipes, the broadband, there's so many things that you need to do with massive public investment projects, the 15 billion exactly that Michael is talking about to bring us up to the level and also to employ massive numbers of people. But the other thing you'd also do, as well as those infrastructural products which add to the overall wealth of the economy and society, is you'd also engage, like Michael's talking about, in wealth creation by the state. Like Ireland is a potentially an enormous haven for not just capital, but for wind and wave energy. It's the potential to be really a forerunner in all of Europe for that, to be a massive exporter of electricity. And now the private sector is talking about doing it, but will only do it on the basis of massive profits, precisely the thing the public sector is doing. Just the last point I'll make, right? You do all these things on the basis of public control and ownership, the banks, massive investment. I still think you've got a problem, because you still can't force the capitalists to invest. They're not going to make profits, they're not going to invest. And so even, you can take all of these measures, but if you leave control of the key sections of the economy in private hands, then you still have a problem, because you're still dependent on their wish to invest based on profits, or their refusal to invest based on profits. And so fundamentally, you need to take the key sections of the economy into democratic public ownership. You need to take, yes, the banks and all that. You need to take the construction companies, take the oil and gas. You need to take the pharmaceutical companies. You need to take all the key sections of the economy, not your small sections of the economy, but the key sections of the economy into public ownership, under democratic workers' control and management. On that basis, the idea of a plan, right? Not a Stalinist plan from the top down, but a real plan, which I'll encourage people to buy Pete Dickinson's book on planning for the planet, which goes into some of the technical arguments about how you can plan, input, output mechanisms, etc., that it's technically possible. But it's fundamentally a political point about political control by the working class, then having a say about what do we want to do in our society, and on that basis being able to plan to overcome the weaknesses of the Irish economy, but also on a European basis to overcome the divisions between core and periphery, and rebuild the economies in a sustainable, including an environmentally sustainable way. Sorry for going on.